Everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Moving from the Global to the Local, Co-Creation for Humanitarian Energy. This is the first in our three-parts webinar series titled People, Policy and Innovation, Humanitarian Energy from Theory to Practice. Our session today is with GIZ, is in partnership with GIZ, the German Development Agency, and a world leader in the international development field. My name is Ben Robinson, and I will be your host today. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Computational University and part of the Humanitarian Engineering and Energy for Displacement, or HEED, team. My work focuses on creating new and disruptive ways of working that enable the forcibly displaced to be the protagonists of their own stories. So before we jump into it, I'd like to just go through a few house rules. So please mute yourself when you come in and out of the call as to cause least disruption to the discussions going on. We are going to be recording the webinar, so please be aware of that. We won't be recording the breakout rooms, so don't worry about that. Please send any questions you have in to the Zoom chat, and we'll try and ask them in the panel discussion section of the webinar. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please let us know, and we can get one of our technical team to help you out. Also, a shameless plug here, please follow us on our Twitter, HEED Energy, with the hashtag Humanitarian Energy to tweet about anything going on today. And also one final thing, if you'd like to rename yourself by going to the three dots at the top of your picture so that we can see your institutional affiliation, that would also be great. So just running through our schedule quickly. We'll start the session with a slightly more informal coffee morning, in inverted commas, to get to know both the panelists and also the rest of you out there in the audience. We will set up a number of breakout rooms to facilitate this. We will then jump into a short introductory talk about the HEED project by Elena, and then dive into our panel discussion designed to push the boundaries of our humanitarian energy sector. So let's get going. Emily, can you please set up our breakout rooms? Yeah. Back everyone, I hope you had some great discussions there in the breakout rooms. So our next, the next part of our agenda is some opening remarks by Elena Gaura on the HEED project and the HEED's relationship with co-design. So Elena, after you.
Thank you. I think for those who have not been part of the breakout room where I participated, again, I have had the pleasure and the honor to lead the HEED project. HEED is a project that was funded by the Research Councils UK. It's an engineering, particularly an engineering research council at a value of just over £1 million over a period of 4 years. And it was one of those amazing projects where we had the flexibility and indeed the remit to explore ways of working with communities to arrive at designing and implementing energy solutions that are sustainable, long-lasting, and fit for purpose in the displacement setting. He'd worked with two community types, refugee communities in Rwanda, specifically in 3 refugee camps, and one community of internally displaced populations in Nepal. I think it was one of the most exciting projects that I have had the pleasure to lead in my portfolio. The project was driven very much about gathering an evidence base on a day-to-day from the workings, the processes, and the successes and failures that we encountered over the 4 years of project life. So we used an amazing amount of sensors and sensor streams. I think we've got billions over billions of data points, all representative and indicative of some aspect of energy need, energy aspiration, energy consumption, or energy sustainability in the interventions. We've had some amazing findings with regards to products that are commonly understood as very impactful in the energy sector, such as, for example, mobile lanterns and improved cook stoves. We've also had findings pertaining to the combination of needs and aspirations that communities expose in the co-creation and co-design processes for energy systems, we've got to understand across the team that co-design is probably the essential nut to crack in order to develop future energy interventions in these very complex settings. And this is because co-design, as Natalie said in our breakout room, it's a misunderstood, misused, and very fashionable word. Everybody's it's interpreting it in a different way, and also because the issues of design are issues of a scientific substance themselves that have never ever been researched, in particular and specifically in relation to socio-economic, political, and technological design in a humanitarian setting. So many a time we talk about socio-technical systems and their development and their co-design. In this setting, it is important that we note that we don't just deal with socio-technical systems, we deal with socio-economic, political, and technological systems. And co-design in that space, it's extremely difficult to do right. I would challenge that we don't know across the global community how to do it right. And I would also hope that the event today will make a step, however small, into doing it better than HEED, better than our previous individual experience in the humanitarian energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. That was a great introduction into HEED's relationship with co-design. So now we'll move on to our panel discussion. Today we have three panelists who come from a diverse background, and we're very interested to see how that diverse background influences their relationship with co-design. First, we have Dr. Khalid Kosher. Khalid is an executive director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute, associate fellow at Chatham House, research associate at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, non-resident fellow at the Lowry Institute in Sydney, and an extraordinary professor in conflict, peace and security in the Faculty of Humanities and Sciences at the University of Maastricht. He is also the chair of the World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council on Migration, and the editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies. Natalie Stoisak is an environmental engineer and has worked for 2 years as an advisor on the global team of the GIZ Energy Solutions for Displacement Settings project, where she is coordinating household energy activities with a focus on cooking energy, e-waste reduction, and user-centered design processes. Natalie has a strong passion since the early years of her career on community-based appropriate technology development, as well as sustainable and local value chains. And finally, Milan Joshi. Mr. Joshi is a development professional with over 10 years of experience in designing and leading various development initiatives for livelihood improvement. Mr. Joshi has led the design of various social research which focuses on productively using energy for livelihood improvement. He also led the co-design elements of the HEED project in Nepal with practical action, focused on identifying the immediate and long-term energy needs and aspirations of displaced people displaced by the earthquake in 2015. So I will now invite each panelist to state their corner, as it were, and give some initial thoughts on the topic of discussion today. Khalid, I'll invite you to go first.
Thank you, Ben. I hope that you can see me, hear me, can you?
Yes.
Yes, great, good. Look, firstly, thanks to you, Ben, and your colleagues for the invitation. And thanks for setting up what I think is a really important discussion. As I just heard the end of Elena's brief description of the HEED project, and I think she's absolutely right that across the humanitarian system, I think we intuit that co-creation and localization is important, but we don't really know how to do it. So the more of these meetings, the better, I think, so that we can begin to share our experiences. So kudos to you for bringing us together. I feel, as I said in the breakout group, a little bit of an imposter here. I know nothing at all about humanitarian energy, and I'm looking forward to learning from you. I think I'm here for two reasons. One, I have a fairly extensive background on migration and refugees. I'm a professor of refugee studies and have been for the last 20 years or so. And secondly, more recently, my day job is, as Ben said, running a global fund here in Geneva, which is focused on preventing violent extremism, which is certainly a stretch from the work that you're doing, but we do pride ourselves on being an exemplar for co-creation in the programs and the projects that we fund in various countries around the world. And I think the only way to perhaps protect myself against the correct accusation that I'm an imposter is to say also that I would agree with Elena, and surely the best way to get better at this is to learn across sectors. Firstly, I think academics and policymakers and practitioners and donors need to have more discussions around what this means and what their limitations are and what their concerns are and where their red lines are. And secondly, learning between sectors, whether it's violence extremism or humanitarianism or development. I think we're all struggling with how to get this right. So the more we can discuss this, the better. I think I just wanted to make 3 brief statements or comments, Ben, in the hope that we can use this to listen to the other panelists and have a good discussion. Firstly, I said I know nothing about humanitarian energy, which is true formally, but I'll share 2 things that I have experienced directly and personally working in refugee camps over the last, again, 20 or 30 years. One is the importance of humanitarian energy at least once came to me when I was really struck by the dangers that refugees and IDPs have at night. And you have very high instances of rape and sexual abuse and violence at night in refugee camps because there's no lighting. And I was really very struck. I spoke to many refugees, many IDPs who said, this is a community that just shuts down at sunset because we have no safe way of doing things. So there's something there that struck me. The other one, of course, was I remember being in Turkey when some of the Syrians were arriving around 2015, and one predicted that what they would want is tents or water or food. The first thing most of them said was, where can I plug my phone in? Because I need to phone home to say that I've got here safely. So some intuition of the work that you're doing, and I think really important. The second point I'd make, again, from a refugee perspective, not a humanitarian energy perspective, why I think this work is so important is it captures, I think, a challenge that the refugee community still hasn't overcome, which is how to bridge humanitarian assistance with development. And I think the humanitarian system still hasn't understood that whether you like it or not, an increasing proportion of refugees are in a protracted situation and will be refugees for decades. I mean, many of the Afghans in Pakistan and Iran have been there for 40 years, and we now think there may be a new exodus of Afghans, many of whom I suspect won't be going home anytime soon. Surely involving them in their futures is the right thing to do, rather than just carrying on to hand out assistance. So I think what you're doing and what we're trying to do is important to sort of catch that pivot that we need to catch in refugee assistance. And then the final point I'll make, coming back to my own work here on preventing violent extremism, and we had a discussion around this in the breakout group just now. Again, I think we all intuit this is the right thing to do. Co-creation, local ownership, working with people to understand their priorities and how we can work together to bridge and overcome capacity gaps, really important. How to do it, by no means well understood at the moment. I think no formal framework for doing it, not really any compilation that I know of good practice of how to do it. I would just reflect that in my opinion and the learning we have here at GSURF, it's really important to be clear that we're doing it not just because it's trendy and it's the right thing to do and everyone is talking about localization and decolonization of aid. We're doing it because we believe it achieves better results. And for me, it's the results focus that really matters. And that brings us on to the final point that I'll make, and the final point that our excellent breakout group discussed, was that you still have the challenge that we as practitioners and policymakers and academics may intuit and perhaps even have examples of why this works and how this works, but convincing donors, we've still got a long way to go. To how to translate the work that we're doing here to donors, I think, is a real challenge. And I think it's about focusing on results. If you follow this path, if you go down the path of local creation and local ownership, you will get better results. And that's the pitch that I always make to my donors that seems to be quite effective so far. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thank you, Khaled. Natalie, would you like to respond and to state your corner?
Yeah, thanks. That was a really excellent introduction. And thank you for that. It was really speaking of my mind. Due to all the reasons that you have mentioned, GIZ has established the project that I'm now working in, due to the need that there is a need for long-term solution and there is a need for having energy supply in displacement settings. And that the humanitarian organizations usually have limitations to implement such kind of things. One is due to technical reasons, but the most pressing shortcoming here is that they have very short funding cycles, and it's impossible to set up a long-term sustainable energy project with that. This is how GIZ came into the setting, and we were asked to bridge this gap. And from the experience that I have now within GIZ in that project, but also the experience that I have working with local organizations in humanitarian settings in Ethiopia, I can say that we are moving within different tension fields here. One is, and that's the biggest tension field we have to bridge here, and I also said it in our breakout room, that what donors want, what governments want, what the international community want, and what they are paying for is usually quite different from what the people need. And they have limited voice and limited chance to really say what they need and to really engage into developing their own solutions for their own problems and identifying also their own problems. And I see that this is the very beginning in how people can actually be engaged in living a sustainable life, living a life where they can make their own decisions and not depending on an international community. Yeah, this is where, I mean, our project is all on supporting the Global Compact on Refugees, which I believe is a very good international framework, how this could be possible. However, bringing this into reality is a very big challenge. Even though some of the countries and governments have already acknowledged the Global Compact on Refugees and even put it into their own legislations. For us, these are the only countries even where we work. But even then, if you visit refugee camps and the surrounding communities, it is quite difficult to see any evidence that it has really trickled down to the bottom. And in my opinion, and yeah, I'm also going to state some statements which may not reflect the entire GIZ. It's a very big organizations, but which are like things that I've observed in my work life. And while I have been talking to refugees and the host community, is that, yeah, people try to really do energy projects. There have been a large number of cook stove dissemination, of electrification, of bringing in solar equipments of different kinds. Some work and some are in place, but the number of items that you see not being used in refugee camps are like enormous. And I can say, like, in the past years, I assume that there is a large amount of funds being wasted on projects which have no impact, or which had only very short-term impact or very few impact. And in my opinion, the reason behind that is that we sit on our desks in Europe and we think to know what is best for people who are really in the need of a lot of things. And one of them is being energy. And I have not experienced, like, for a very long time, how it is to live without cooking energy and to live without life. For me, it is very difficult to know what you would need then. So what I believe is, like, to really have an impact, we have to start with the people. We have to make them to be able to have a voice, like, to formulate their problems. And also we have to we have to look at them as people who have a lot of resources, ideas and skills, and we have to kind of facilitate the unlocking of this potential and help people, support people to develop their own solutions. And wherever there are gaps, like in finance or in knowledge or whatever, I believe, like, humanitarian and development work can jump in and lead and guide processes, provide resources, to really initiate processes whereby the refugees and the host communities themselves can create solutions and scale it up, and then have, like, a sustainable living of their choice.
Fascinating, Natalie. Thank you very much. Milan, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, host, for organizing this interesting webinar. I think the discussions here will be very important for us to, gather or gather evidences on how we can do things better in future. So I think going from the basics, co-creation is all about adding value to what we already have, right? And when we tend to add value, we need to think about the sustainability aspect as well as the impact aspect of the intervention that we want to do in the displaced camps or whatever, right? So most of my experiences is coming from the my engagement with the heat camp that we had in Nepal. In our context, we were focused on two aspects. First was about meeting the immediate needs of the communities, that is regarding like Khalid said, there were risks of different rapes or thieves intruding in the camps if there was no light. So that was our immediate risk, immediate value that we wanted to add. But we also equally considered as a co-creation element the long-term impact that our intervention can have, and then that was the reason we powered our street lights with ground sockets where they could use these ground sockets for different productive uses, like and we did observe in the camp that there were instances of the small shops trying to operate, powering the tailor machines or refrigerators, or use in homes like for the fans, etc. So so if we reflect back to how we co-created or co-designed those interventions, the population actually didn't directly demand a socket that was accessible to them in the ground. So it was more about observing their expressed need rather than the felt need itself. So the point that I want to make is often we tend to focus on what the community said, what is the immediate needs based on the questionnaires or checklist or whatever, right? So I think the point that I want to make is co-creation in humanitarian energy programs should also be equally focusing on the express needs of those communities. Like for example, the displaced population that we had that were coming to the camp that we tried to intervene had some entrepreneurial mindset, so they were running some sort of small enterprises in their former villages. So now we tried to see, we didn't tell them that this energy can be used for your enterprises or something, but we did make them explicit that this energy is available to you, you can use it for whatever purpose you want. And in the daytime when the energy supply is pretty good, so those energy was used for general livelihood thing. So it helps these displaced people not merely from making energy accessible, but also diverting their stress, or thinking about sources of income that that they have lost while they were displaced from their from their normal settings, let's say. And we also have another interesting intervention regarding making accessible internet services through the street lights that we had. Now it was not part of the co-design as such, but the result was very interesting in a sense that the internet was very useful for the people to be connected with the outside world and get updated about the news that is happening around the world as well as in the country. And most importantly, it was useful when the COVID pandemic hit around. So all the schools were closed, and then both the government took on the stand to continue the education. So if there was no energy that we provided and the internet that we provided along with that, then the students would never be able to sit on the exams or classrooms, and that would result in losing their years or whatever. So to repeat or to sum up what I have said, Co-creation is about moving beyond engaging stakeholders, to also observing and offering best practices that is contextualized to the requirement of the population who are being displaced, empowering or informing the participants, like in many cases what happens is these displaced people, they might not have idea about the best practices of the use of humanitarian energy, or kind of best practices elsewhere. So as a humanitarian and development experts, it becomes our responsibilities in the co-design process to make them aware, to empower them that these are the possible kind of long-term potentials of the humanitarian energy that can be made available. And the point is to appropriately co-design, that meets the short-term as well as long-term aspirations. By this, I mean, kind of also, kind of thinking about the long-term resilience thing, and be very clear on when to engage and whom to engage. If we start engaging everyone, and at every time, then we might be in a very difficult situation like we had in Nepal. So like, for example, the local government, they had their own priorities on what should the humanitarian energy look like, right? The people, they had their own priorities. The NGOs and INGOs, they had their own preferences. So we need to be very clear on the kind of the when to engage, which stakeholder to engage at what point, and when to stop engaging with these stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, what matters to us most is the benefits or the impacts that we create, or the value that we add to the displaced population through the humanitarian energy interventions. I'll stop it here for now.
Fantastic. And that theme is interesting, and how co-design methods can add value to existing programs. And it links into what both Khaled and Natalie were saying, in that it feels like the right thing to do, even though we haven't managed to do it right yet in the way in which the humanitarian energy sector necessarily wants to do it. And that sort of leads into my first question a little bit, and that is that this term of co-design is actually very slippery. And we've just had 15 minutes of discussion with a whole range of definitions of what we all think we mean by this term. So instead of asking you all to give a definition, I'm actually going to take that one step further and ask you, how do you, in your areas of work, effectively operationalize this quite slippery, abstract term? Feel free to jump in with whoever has something to mind.
Can say a few words if you like, Ben, again, as the non-expert on the panel. And again, a different context. We're a global fund providing grants to local communities to build resilience against violent extremism. So a very different context. But I think my answer will illustrate the constraints. I mean, I think we should have a serious conversation here. We all intuit that this is the right thing to do. A, it's hard, and B, there are limitations. You can't co-create everything. Sometimes there are restraints and constraints. I think understanding what those are is important. So, I mean, the way that we try to do it is we, as far as is feasible, once we've identified a community at risk of radicalization to violent extremism, again, a different context, we will go to that community and work with religious leaders and school teachers and parents associations and local authorities to try to understand with them what they think the challenges are, more importantly, what they think the solutions are. And then we will, literally provide money to support the projects that they develop. So that's the positive side, right? We work with as many stakeholders as possible within the local context to understand local solutions, and we try to fund those solutions. That's the tick in the correct side of the box. The other side, of course, is given that we're spending donors' money, we need to make sure that we are funding people who've been on a terrorist screening list, an anti-terrorist screening list. We need to make sure we're funding people who have some notion of what an audit is, what a financial trail is, who can provide some sort of reporting, however basic it is. So of course there are limitations. One can't create, at least we haven't found a way to co-create those donor-driven processes of reporting, of audit, of monitoring and evaluation. You can include people in monitoring and evaluation, you can include people in collecting results, but ultimately there are certain constraints that I think still do need to be imposed, regrettably. I suppose that's my sense of it.
Natalie, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. Like, co-creation is really difficult to implement in everywhere, and honestly speaking, neither humanitarian nor development cooperation is made for co-creation. It's in its nature, not co-creation. However, I would like to just in our project we are trying to implement co-creative methodologies. As I said, we don't call it co-creation. We call the process user-centered design, as it is very simple. We put the user in the center, and we then design together with them, or together like with whatever capacity and resource we find in the area. And by area, I mean like the exact location where the refugee camp is, and not the country. Because we also tend sometimes to forget that a country is not a country, and that in the different areas things are also quite different, and that you can in one area of a country find private sector who is able to do things, and in the other area you have a lot of conflicts and it's totally humanitarian driven and you have nothing. So we have developed a methodology which we have tested now in Gambela region in Western Ethiopia. And with an immense positive reaction from our main partner UNHCR, and also from the government partner, and in particular also from every person that we have involved in that, which is first of all refugees and the host community. So we have developed our overall aim was also not so open, because we are also donor driven and our donors want certain things. So we cannot go there and say like, tell us your problems and then we develop a solution for it. But of course, it has to be in our thematic approach of our project. And we found that one of the really pressing needs in very underdeveloped regions is cooking energy. And one of the issues also which endangers the safety and also the nutrition of, in particular, women and girls and the most vulnerable people. So in Gambela region, that is also one of the biggest challenge, and has also dramatic effect on the environment and on the resource which are available. So we have focused this process on cooking energy, and we went there like with experts in that field from the international community and the Ethiopian private sector. We have started a process with the aim to develop a cooking energy system that can be produced locally, scaled locally, and that is perfectly suitable to what people need. And we have started that process. It was a 10 days workshop series, not more than that. After 10 days, we had a prototype of a system. So we started that workshop with 3 days, very practical workshop where cooking was the center activity with the refugees and the host communities. And we have then done several workshops like with local vendors of cooking systems, or like different items which are similar to that, with people who are able to produce things in that area. And of course, also with the humanitarian development and government actors. And at the end of these 10 days, we had a prototype of a cook stove, including also like potential alternative fuels that can be burned in that. And as we speak, our experts who are doing that are currently there in like improving the production process, because that comes also after that. It's nice to develop something and a system that works, but at the end it has to be produced in scale with a minimal waste of resources where they are already scarce. We have done that in very close partnership with our operational partner UNHCR, and everyone in the space was super happy and overwhelmed actually by its success and its simpleness, because we didn't do much. We didn't bring anything in. We didn't come with very complicated technologies. We basically used what people already know what to do. And I believe like that this is a very promising process because it stays when we go. It stays when humanitarian organizations go. It also stays when GIZ goes, because people have the skill. We just topped up on it. We just optimize the process. We optimize the product, and people have now the knowledge even to optimize this product by themselves. Because in the local value chain, the feedback always comes back to the producer when it works. And when the local value chain is established by an organization, then the information gets stuck somewhere. Yeah, we are at the beginning of this, but this was one of our, let's say, basic co-design, very participatory process. And we are looking forward to the results, and it will be also shared on our portal on Energypedia. And we're also happy to scale that up, and all will be open source, of course, for anyone who wants to implement this approach.
And Natalie, you've mentioned the private sector engagement in your process. Would either of the other panelists like to expand on how they see the private sector fitting into this co-design process?
While Milan is sorry, Natalie, after you, go on.
No, I just wanted to clarify that, of course, in this one, like the private sector was more like people who are knowledgeable, like producers of little stoves. So when we talk about private sector, what I have not always in mind is not these big companies who are able to set up a solar factory or something like that. It is also a person who just produces something from clay. For me, that's also private sector. I just wanted to clarify that.
And I just to I think expand on Natalie's comments on the private sector. And I think Humera also asked a question about it in the chat. I mean, it seems to me, certainly compared to the work that we're trying to do here, it is or should be possible to engage the private sector in this world for two reasons. One is that, you know, refugees are at the center of corporate social responsibility. Lots of companies recognize the importance of displacement, which is great. We've taken 20 years to do it, but at last we recognize that this is an important issue for the private sector to engage in. And secondly, of course, there are lots of companies that are working on energy. You know, it's quite hard to convince companies to give you money, but if they can give you their expertise or their products or their supply chains, that I think is an easier sell. So the intersection of a topic that we all recognize as a global public good, refugees, displacement, humanitarian assistance, with being able to say to the private sector, we want your expertise, your products, not just your money, I think that's a winning combination.
Milan, over to you.
Sure. I think most of it is covered, but I'd re-stress that this slippery aspect of co-design, as you have rightly put, is a very kind of demanding and iterative process. And in our context, we try to create a champions of co-creation early in the project initiation phase. By champions, we try to engage more profoundly with local leaders. It might be mostly they are political leaders, as well as local government and authorities, you know, to make them, to engage them in each process of decision making, to ensure that the solutions or the humanitarian energy interventions that we are proposing is aligning with their long-term requirements. And it demanded, as Khalid said, a serious conversation with and a credible conversation with these local leaders and government authorities. And the most important part, it was also a very difficult exercise in itself. You know, you can't really have easy discussions with local governments or authorities easily. So what helped us in those period of time was we came up with different options of humanitarian energy solutions that we can offer, and we did an analytical review on the cost versus the benefits on each of the interventions that we are proposing. We considered street lights, we considered water, pumps, we considered many other things, So we did cost versus benefit analysis, and two important factors were two aspects of lens, I would say, you know, were important while we analyze the cost versus benefits. The first was about the immediate requirements, and then the second was about the long-term recovery, you know, kind of potentials. And also there was some elements about whether there are other actors who can, you know, kind of provide these interventions on their own. And if they, you know, why should HEED at the project, Coventry University and Practical Action, why should we do that specific intervention rather than other interventions, right? What is the value add of our interventions? So we focused on those, and we were able to convince these champions of co-creation, saying that okay, these are the, you know, kind of interventions, the options of the interventions, and this is what we recommend based on our global experiences, as well as, you know, kind of the needs of the people, etc. And I think that was a very fruitful exercise in itself to help us own the co-creation process, as well as, you know, kind of mitigate the negative impacts or the implementation challenges that might come across as we move ahead. Over.
And I'd be really interested to hear if people would like to unpack, how do you decide who you engage in that co-design process? We all talk about, well, we did this and this and this and this, but actually, what is the decision-making process that goes into deciding who you engage in the co-design process?
Definitely, there might be different tools, but the one we used was about community mapping, the matrix regarding the power and the influence, you know, the stakeholder mapping tool that we have. So we, under the community mapping, we first identify who are the, you know, potential stakeholders who might positively as well as negatively, you know, kind of support the interventions that we are having. And then we identify what is the level of power that these stakeholders can, you know, kind of exhibit if they are to support or, you know, not support. So using those tools, we try to identify the, you know, top 3 or 5 stakeholders that we need to, you know, kind of engage very closely, or engage just superficially, or not engage at all, you know. So those are some of the tools that were used.
Natalie or Khaled, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, for us, it's quite simple. We in that process, in that certain process, I'm not talking about generally how a GIZ project is being set up. That's also quite standard. But in that particular process, we first start to engage the user of the system, the people that finally should use that item that we want to design. That's the most important thing. And then we look like who in this area, in the vicinity of this camp, could be part of the value chain. What are the resources there, like the human resources, as well as also like the natural resources, because cooking system always needs fuel. That some projects seem to forget that, and the fuel has to come like on daily basis. So it's very important to involve everyone who is involved in this value chain, and that, for example, also means if the fuel is wood or charcoal or briquette, then it's also the resource of the people who live there. So it's very important to involve them as well. And then with that, you also come very soon to involve the local government, because yeah, as Milan also said, they're the ones who have the power to say no to everything. And to restrict what you're doing. So that's also quite crucial, and also involve them like from the very bottom, not always like the top decision makers. And then of course for us, as we are working in this humanitarian and development space, it's always very important to use to involve everyone who's doing similar things, such doesn't have to be energy, but who works on livelihood activities, who work on afforestation, and yeah, who work on environmental protection, etc., because those are the people who have the power to also engage in what we are doing, and that is needed, because one could start a co-creation process and the other one starts providing a similar product for free, and then the value chain is very difficult to establish. So at the end, you involve almost everyone, because everyone really has a power on the success of such kind of project, and everything is really connected, in particular in these very remote areas where refugee camps are situated. Everything is connected and everything is depending on each other.
And I imagine that process is easy to say in theory, but the reality on the ground is much more complex.
I think, if I can, I think both complex and time consuming. And that's again, the challenge here in trying to convince donors this is worthwhile. If you do it right, this will take longer to involve the right people, to consult the right stakeholders, to design your project, to fund the project, to get results on the project is all a longer, more complex, more cost intensive process, I think by definition. But again, it should be worthwhile. And just I largely echo what Natalie said in terms of how we do it here. Clearly, the first person we consult, at least, is effectively the end beneficiary, the person who will be using the projects in our case that we're funding. But Natalie is absolutely right. The last thing you want to do is generate resentment or divisions or some sort of dichotomies by not involving other people who are clearly involved. I mean, we all know in the refugee setting that you've got to pay attention to the host communities as well as refugees, otherwise you're doomed. I mean, I can imagine being a Bangladeshi sitting in Cox's Bazar saying, hold on, the refugees are getting to co-create, and no one's consulting me about how my energy is delivered. How come they're getting an advantage over me? So in our context, we always make sure that we try to consult, as Natalie says, local authorities, other people who are part of the sort of local ecosystem.
And if I may just add to that, I think it is as well also important to involve the international community, as I do right now, because I'm talking about this and I also belong to that international community. Because one of the really crucial points in humanitarian energy, since it's a relatively, unfortunately, new topic, it's really important to talk more about what works and what doesn't work. And unfortunately, we have quite a long record of what doesn't work. And I think it's time for making these cases which are working, and to show that, and then to also do it, and invite others also to learn from each other, and not start any kind of competition of who's best in the space and who does the best work, but on really learning from each other also internationally, and not repeating the same mistakes over and over again. You can really see that when you go into refugee camps, and the change, unfortunately, is quite slow. And while we have all these opportunities on connecting through internet all the time in very fast speed, usually, we should really make use of that and talk more about what works and what doesn't work, and not only focus on like written reports and data which have been collected, because in this very fast developing economies, this data is sometimes outdated within the same year. And I think what really works are processes which can be scaled, rather than like data which are also many times not very correct.
Great, and that leads really into my next question, and that's about aspirational futures. What do we think the sector should look like in 10, 15, 20, 50 if you really want to go wild? What should the sector look like in that time period in terms of co-design?
Ben, can I go first, simply because I apologize, I will have to sign off in a couple of minutes, but I'm sure Natalie Milan can deal with the questions from your participants better than me anyway. Three sort of observations on that. One is, I think, and I think it's come up in this discussion, deciding or defining or working out whether co-creation and co-design is a means or an end. Is it something we do to achieve better humanitarian energy or preventive multi-streamism, or is it actually an end in itself? Is what we're doing trying to achieve co-design and co-creation? I think there's still an interesting debate around means versus ends that needs to be unraveled a little bit. A second observation, to echo something I said at the beginning, I think this is a great example or kind of moment to really pivot the refugee paradigm away from just humanitarian assistance as something more to development. And I think, you know, the work that you're doing is exactly what is needed to shift that paradigm. And I think the final thing I'd observe, and again, not knowing humanitarian energy, but it certainly seems to me, having listened to you and the experts on the panel compared to my field, I mean, energy is fairly neutral. It doesn't need to be politically sensitive. It seems to me this is a safe space in which to work out how to do co-creation in refugee camps, rather than gender-based violence or trafficking. And there's more politically sensitive stuff than this. So starting in a fairly safe political space is the place to do it. You've got a laboratory here. And I think that you can really work out how to do this and then begin to share the lessons with other, perhaps more politically sensitive areas. So I mean, my aspiration is that you keep on doing your great work, Ben and colleagues, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Great, thank you, Gavin. Who would like to go next? Or indeed respond to some of those comments?
I would kindly like to oppose the fact that energy is not political, because it might be true for something like a cook stove or something, but even that is not, because electrification is quite a political topic. For example, in Ethiopia, no one is allowed to produce and sell energy except the government. And electrification always means refugees stay, because they have an infrastructure, and that means they stay. And that is a very political topic. Also in Europe, like European governments don't want refugees to stay. The same thing's true for all the governments in Africa. They don't want them to stay, and they certainly don't want them to have an electric grid. So I would say, like, it's not possibly there are more political topics, but this is also quite political. And when it comes like to cooking energy and forests, forest is really disappearing all over Africa, and it may not be now, but definitely in the next years it will be super political, because it's also well connected to climate change and with the CO2 reduction aims of the countries which they've promised in the climate agreement. So I would say it's quite political.
Well, not much to add from my end. Is pretty much covered, but I think it might not apply for issues around refugee camps, but for displaced population due to natural disasters or something like that, we could perhaps, as I see, the sector could move into forecast-based humanitarian engineering planning. Like, for example, practical action. I'm talking more about natural disasters, etc. Like, for example, we have something called a flood forecasting model, which gives kind of early warning on the potential disasters and the displacement, the potential displacement of peoples due to floods or landslides, etc. So I think as the sector evolves, and we could perhaps think about kind of embedding humanitarian energy with some of these preparedness aspects, linking with the overall resilience of the population that we want to work for. So I think yeah, I think I'll stop it here.
And I just realized that I haven't answered to your question. Can I? I was busy opposing.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 50 years probably a bit difficult to say at this point. Hopefully no refugees and everyone has energy, renewable energy in the world, but let's be real. Yeah, maybe in the next years, I think one of the very important steps also looking into climate change is, of course, supporting renewables and bridge the more expenses through like international aid. And really also looking into like every new system which is being brought in should be renewable. And sorry to say, LPG is not a renewable fuel. And also an improved cook stove is not based on renewable fuels if you don't take care of growing trees or growing fuel. And that is being done, like it's quite a practice on cooking energy, which I'm always a bit scared to see, because that's another non-renewable fuel which is brought in by the international community, which I find quite dangerous. Then, of course, for co-creation, donors need to be more flexible. It's impossible to do co-creation when you have a donor in your back who exactly defines what you need to do, because then you cannot ask refugees or a host community, what do you need and how can we support you? Because then it's the donor who decides. So donors who are flexible, who give you a framework, but who don't give you like aims in numbers and certain things, because then it's impossible to ask refugees and host communities to be engaged more. And then, of course, I see like a big perspective in the proper implementation of the Global Compact on refugees, and in giving rights to refugees, in being engaged in work, in self-sustaining activities, and in making their own livelihood, and also being supported by that, but also have the regulations for this, making them to be able to move freely, etc. Yeah, then for the sector itself, for humanitarian energy people, I think it's supporting all this on the regulation side, on the international politics side, but then also like on the developing more appropriate technology solutions together with the people who have those resources to do that, who know what's going on, and support very local private sector to be engaged in finding the solutions. I think this is like the future, because we need to start doing projects which have a real exit strategy, a real honest exit strategy, and is not waiting for the next funding cycle, but something which can stand after humanitarian and development organizations leave, and which is not a reason to ask for new funds for the new funding cycle.
Yeah, and just to add, Ben, I think as I was thinking about the question, rethinking about the question, I think it does make sense for us to understand that the whole scenario of energy generation might change with introduction of hydrogen fuels and solars becoming extremely competitive with, kind of new technologies, as well as new options of energy coming up. So it might change the use of current energy technologies such as rooftops or small scale solar, etc. So I think the kind of the refugees, or the researches into these kind of displaced camps, etc., can be one of the input in terms of kind of helping global or regional policies shape how kind of humanitarian energy might look like in future as well. So just to add on that.
Fantastic. I think there's also a future discussion about this intersection between humanitarianism and international development work. And I imagine that boundary will become more and more blurred as crises become more and more protracted as the future becomes now. So I think that's all the questions I have for our panelists. I'll now open up the discussion to the audience. Are there any questions that anyone has been holding on to and would like to ask, either directly? If you want to ask a question directly, just pop your webcam on, or I can have a quick scroll back through the chat and see if there are any relevant questions there. I can open the questions with a question from the chat. And we talked a little bit about the role of private sector partners, and this question asks, what happens in the absence of this private sector market where a distribution model isn't sustainable?
I wonder where there is an absence of private sector. Of course, if you think of big companies, yes, there's absence of that. I mean, Ethiopia is not in particular, for example, famous for its good and strong private sector. However, wherever you go, even if like in the very far off region of Gambela, you find people who are private entrepreneurs, whether they're formal private entrepreneurs or not. But there are vendors, there are producers, there are people who do something, produce something and sell it. For me, this is a private sector. Of course, it's a very small private sector and sometimes very informal, and it's difficult as organizations to work with that. But for me, this is a starting point which can be scaled, which can be looked in, because a small vendor can eventually become also a big entrepreneur and employ people if its business is going well. So in my opinion, we have to stop looking only at big companies with homepages and business cards, but we have to look at everyone who's involved in markets. That's for me private sector, and I haven't seen in my life a place where there's no market. You always, even if people just sell one piece of onion, but you will find people who sell things. There's always a market, and where there's a market, that's possible to scale it up. And where there's no market, then there's a really big need for humanitarian aid, and that has nothing to do what we have discussed now, because we are discussing about protracted settings here. And that is like where people are safe, where people like are given like the most important things to survive. And in these settings, you always find a market, and with that, always a private sector.
I would support Natalie's argument as well. So that's what we observed in our context as well, and that is quite true. Whenever there is an opportunity and whenever there is a vibrant private sector in the economy, the private sector will always, kind of be the first to respond to the market needs. Like we did observe that, kind of during the COVID pandemic also, the number of masks producers and, sanitizer producers were so high already, so it was because the private sectors were able to, identify the opportunities for their products. So similar thing happens everywhere, because private sectors are the ones who drive the economy in many sense, and they are always looking for opportunities in every challenge that sector or humanitarian sector might face. So I support that argument, Natalie.
Fantastic. And there's another question just popped up in the chat here. Hajar, I was curious to know, how do you course correct when co-design processes go wrong?
It's a really nice question. Can I can I take it? In my opinion, it can't go wrong, because it starts from the people who need it. And what is very important in my opinion, in an iterative, in a co-design process or user-centered design process, however you call it, is that it's iterative. So you develop something, and at the end, when you have that solution, you test it in reality, and then you run the whole process again and again until the product is perfect. And when conditions change, you run it again and again. As I said before, for example, when you have a product as an outcome of this co-design project, then you make sure that this linkage always exists, that iteration and rethinking of this designed product is always possible in the chain, so that users, like for example, it may change like that people start eating different things, or well, food program gives them different food, so they need a different cook stove. If you have designed this and established a value chain in such kind of system, then the producer will realize that its product is no longer being sold, and he or she will go and run the same process to get again like a cook stove or a cooking system which could work for that. So this iteration, in my opinion, is like a very core point of a co-design process, and has to be always made possible and integrated in that.
We have 1 minute remaining. Milan, would you like to give your one sentence response?
Okay, if I have to give it in a sentence, then I think it would be, I think we talked about engaging right stakeholders at the right time. So that would be a very important part of ensuring that, kind of, even if we fail, or if our co-design is not correct, then there is someone who is there to, kind of own the entire process and help us with identifying alternatives. So I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Fantastic. And that brings our webinar to a close.